Hello, everyone. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio, a subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC, where our mantra is to educate, enlighten, and entertain. And, folks, that I do every time I interview one of my phenomenal guests, and today will be no exception. I have with me today Dain, who is a historian, a lawyer, author, and writer of this wonderful book, A History of Boston, which I highly recommend for everyone to read, especially if you are going to Boston. And I just want to mention the contemporary photography by Peter Vander Walker. Stunning photography. I really enjoyed reading sections of this book, and I want to welcome Dain to Chatting with Betsy. Welcome, Daniel.
Betsy, you're so kind with everything you said about the book and Peter's photography. It's a great pleasure of mine to be on. Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. I have to start with the cover first because before we recorded, I was telling you I get obsessed with book covers for some reason, and the cover is just stunning. Where is this in Boston, or what building am I looking at? Because I'm not familiar with Boston at all.
So that's historic Copley Square in Boston, and I love the contrast of the old, the historic, and the newer. So it's Trinity Church, which is Boston's probably greatest architecture, which is a Henry Hobson Richardson design building from the 1860s. And behind it is the John Hancock Tower, now called 200 Clarendon Street, which was built in the 1970s. And it's a wonderful contrast between the old and the new, which is part of what we wanted to illustrate from the book. I'll also mention that the photograph was taken from the top of what's called the New Old South Church, which you don't see in the picture, but is another important historical building in Boston because it's where the Old South Meeting House relocated from downtown to the Back Bay when the Back Bay was completed. The Back Bay was a landfill project, and the Old South Meeting House, of course, is famous because it's where the Boston Tea Party was planned.
I just think that your book is for everyone, but really, folks, if you ever go to Boston, Massachusetts, buy this book, read it, and take it with you because you will learn so much about Boston. It's an 800-page book, but don't let that overwhelm you because this is the type of book you can pick up and just read whatever chapter you want. It's like, I would say, several books or stories in a book, Daniel.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that, and that's a little bit of how I approached it. I guess two notes about how to read the book. One is that, as you mentioned, I am a lawyer, and I'm a trial lawyer, and my job as a trial lawyer is really, as an advocate, is to tell stories in a compelling way, have a narrative that's interesting. And so I think what I did with this book is similar to what I do in my day job, which is tell interesting stories. And the book is both 800 pages as a whole, and it has a unifying arc to it. But it's also a collection of maybe 1,000 different short stories about Boston history that don't necessarily have to be read all at the same time or in consecutive order, and hopefully each of them are found to be interesting. But what was a guide for me in doing the book is thinking about it as if I were a tourist. In fact, I approached the project as if I were a tourist in that, I went around and visited over 70 different historic sites, and I was that crazy person that embarrassed my kids with a notebook during these historic tours, and I would ask questions and take notes, and I read 265 books cover to cover on different aspects of Boston history and doing my research. And so the question for me of whether or not a story merited being included or not is, I said, if I were a tourist, was this the kind of thing that I would be interested in? Would I be asking questions about this? And if the answer was yes, it was something that I would be curious about as a visitor to Boston, then I wanted to include it in the book.
I think that, in my own opinion, my own humble opinion, that this is just outstanding. Now, is this your first book that you wrote?
Well, it's the first book that you would think of as one that I wrote. I am credited as the editor of a book on deposition practice, but I like to think that the history of Boston is a lot more interesting than deposition practice. But I do consider myself a professional writer, not necessarily of books in this form, but as a trial advocate, I spend every single day doing writing all day long, and so the process of writing the book was very similar to my job as an advocate.
I have to ask you this, Dan. What motivated you to write this awesome book, and also being a lawyer? I mean, you are a busy guy. How did you have the time to do the writing and the research? I know that's a lot of questions at once.
Yeah, no,
I'm from New Jersey. I'm a Jersey girl.
No, it's great. It's a bit of an unusual story for someone who wrote 800 pages of a book, and in fact, the manuscript was 900 pages. We cut 100 pages out just to fit in the binding. But I didn't, if you can believe it, I didn't actually start with the intention of writing a book. It was only a couple years into the project that I thought, geez, this could actually be a book. It really started just in my fascination with Boston history and wanting to understand it better. And a couple things were motivating me, and I started the project in December of 2017. The first is that I love being a tour guide of Boston when people are from out of town. And even when people are from Boston, whenever I'm walking around the city, I'm always pointing out historical sites and saying, well, did you know that this happened there? But I had this voice in the back of my head sometimes that it was like, am I getting these stories exactly right? We'd be in the North End, and I'd tell the story of the ride of Paul Revere and the signal from the Old North Church. And I'd wonder, geez, do I have it right? Was Paul Revere in the North End signaling to someone else, or was he in Charlestown receiving the signal? And in fact, the answer is Paul Revere was in the North End and was the one who arranged for the signal to be sent. But there were these little gaps in my knowledge of Boston history, and I felt like I just wanted to understand it better. And the other part was, as a lawyer who represents, my clients are real estate developers. When I advocate for my clients who are building projects in Boston, my clients are really making a prediction about the future, which is if they spend the time to build a building, which could take 3 to 4 years to pull off, they're sort of predicting that when the building's done, people are going to continue to want to live, work, play, visit, shops, study in Boston. This period we've been in of about 30 years of great success both in Boston and in cities really around the world is it going to continue? And I'm old enough to remember I grew up in Boston in the 1970s and 1980s. That Boston could best be described then as a basket case. In 1950, the population of Boston was 801,000 people. In 1980, the population of Boston was 520,000 people. The city lost almost 300,000 people in 3 decades. And this was a phenomenon that was not just in Boston, but cities were struggling all around the country and all around the world in most of the 20th century. But I also knew that in the 19th century in Boston was so successful as a city that they needed to use landfill to fill in most of the city. What's today Boston was historically water, and it was filled in with gravel by knocking down some of the drumlin, some of the hills around Boston. So I was fascinated by this question of why Boston has swung between periods of success and failure and back to success as a city. And so I wanted to understand that phenomenon better to be able to advise my clients. And so what I did one weekend night, I believe, in December of 2017 is I went around my house and pulled off my shelf all the books that I had about different aspects of Boston history. And I figured I would just flip through them and take some notes and just to educate myself. But the more notes that I took and the more time I spent going through the books, the more questions I had. And so I started typing up my notes, and it was 20 pages and then 30 pages. And I thought, I'll just use this as a cheat sheet. So if I wanted to talk about Boston history, I could pull it out quickly beforehand and refresh my memory. And then it was 100 pages of notes, and I started writing in complete sentences and paragraphs and making notes of more questions that I had. And as I mentioned about approaching it as if I were a tourist, I just constantly was asking questions. Well, why did this happen? And what happened next? And what was going in Boston during this period? And it just compelled me to keep doing more and more research. And as it got bigger and bigger, about halfway through the project, I was like, all right, this is starting to look like a book. and I should try to finish this. And in terms of having time, it was a challenge because I generally did not work on it during the workday. I would, I come into Boston. I have an office in town, and put in a full day and go home and spend time with family and homework and soccer practice and everything else, and pay bills. And then only after all that was done, usually about 10 o'clock at night, I would sit down and start doing more research and writing. And I usually work from about 10 or 11 at night till maybe 1 in the morning. And I just, even though it was a sort of a big time commitment, it was just a project that I really loved doing. But by early 2020, I was really thinking, oh my goodness, how in the world am I going to finish this? It just seemed so daunting because I had so many books that were still in my queue and so many notes of things I still wanted to do research on. And then the pandemic came, and not only did it save my commuting time, but just all the different committees and boards I'm on, and for about 3 months before things sort of got back up and running was via Zoom for a lot of things. So much of the world stopped in March and April and May of 2020.
Yeah.
And I got an enormous amount done just with that extra time that I had. And once things started picking up again by the summer of 2020, I'd made enough progress that at that point I said, all right, I know I can get this done. Let me just power through and get to the point where I can find a publisher.
Well, I say this all the time on my show when I have a author and writer on, that the research that goes into a book that we as readers pick up, we just take it for granted. We pick up the book, we read it. But I'll tell you what, Dan, I have really appreciated, since doing my show, the time that the author and writers take to research a book, to take the time to go through photographs and all the research. And I just have to thank you for writing this book. I mean, Boston is so rich in history from what I remember from, grammar school and parts of reading your book, the Revolutionary War and, the Boston Tea Party. And it goes on and on. The wonderful hospitals that are in Boston. It's just incredible. I had a laugh.
It's a rich history. Yeah, go. I'm sorry,
yes.
Go ahead.
When I was reading your book, and it brought me back when you were talking about the Prince Spaghetti Day commercial.
Yeah, I know, right? Like little things, little anecdotes like that I just felt I had to include, right? Like someone who wants to know and understand Boston history should know about the Prince Spaghetti Day commercial because it's sort of an indelible part of Boston's history. So I have big stories like about the Revolutionary War and little small stories like commercials that were filmed in Boston.
I remember that. I do. I remember that.
It's a general history. It tells of the politics and economics and geography of Boston, but also social and cultural history. I have a chapter on the history of Boston sports and history of music that's from Boston and history of movies that were filmed or based in Boston and TV shows, like Cheers and Boston Legal and Ally McBeal and shows like that. And, theater and, I have history of crime in Boston and organized crime and Whitey Bulger and
yes.
race relations and the immigrant period and it's a long and rich history. And you mentioned the Revolutionary War, but the abolition movement in America really starts in Boston. The women's rights movement, in a lot of ways, starts in Boston as an outgrowth from the abolition movement. The Industrial Revolution starts around Boston and Waltham and then Lowell in the 1810. The American Industrial Revolution starts around Boston in the 1810s and really becomes the pillar of the New England economy through the rest of the 19th century. And, of course, the Industrial Revolution spreads to the rest of the United States. But, such an important role in all of that.
It is. It's funny that you mentioned Whitey Bulger because, of course, my eye drew right to the organized crime. I guess being from New Jersey, I'm interested in the mafia and organized crime. And I had to do research, Dan. It made me look up Whitey Bulger because I heard the name, but I wasn't really, familiar with what he did. And when I was looking and reading about Whitey Bulger, I'm like, oh my goodness, you had a lot going on with the organized crime in Boston during that time period. Which was
in the 20th century in Boston and other American cities were periods of both the grip of organized crime as well as public corruption. And there's of course, the direct victims of organized crime, the families who lost loved ones or who had money extorted. But the broader impact is really across the entire community that when businesses are being shaken down or being asked for handouts for public corruption, it discourages public investment in cities. And so cities have to get past and get over organized crime and public corruption if they're going to be successful. And Boston has done a great job of that in the last 30 years. Obviously, it hasn't been eliminated, but it's hardly has the grip that it did in the 20th century. And I think that's really been true across America, that the cities have done much better getting past the period of really being in the grip of organized crime and public corruption.
I did like the section I read about immigration, of all, the different immigrants that came over. And in Boston, from what I could remember, I was reading your book, you have, I guess, just like everywhere else, neighborhoods which have, your Irish, your Italians, Jewish, and African Americans. Is it still like that in Boston, or is it getting more mixed?
Well, there still are neighborhoods, and they have a lot of character. So the ones that are most well known and I think enjoyed as sort of centers of culture are Boston's Chinatown and Boston's North End, which is Boston's Little Italy. And they're both Chinatown's full of Chinese restaurants, as well as Japanese and Vietnamese and Thai restaurants, Malaysian restaurants, and the North End is absolutely packed with really fantastic Italian restaurants. And I think people would say that these types of ethnic enclaves give cities character. But at the same time, cities also have to be dynamic and evolve. The North End, even though it's been an Italian neighborhood for 100 years, originally was home to the Massachusetts Native Americans. And then the Puritans came, and it became a place where Yankee Protestants lived, and it had a small free black population in colonial times, even though slavery was allowed in all of the colonies, but there was a free black community that lived in the North End. And then in the 1840s and 1850s, Irish immigrants came and settled in the waterfront area in the North End, and Jewish immigrants started arriving in the North End in the early 1880s, and by the late 1880s, 1890s, it really became where Italian immigrants were coming. And so these neighborhoods change over time, and so there's a tension between preserving those things that we love about cities and these neighborhoods that we really do want to preserve, but also realizing that you can't put cities in amber, because when you try to do that, you try to prevent all change, the cities stagnate. And in some ways we saw that in Boston and in other American cities throughout the 20th century, where we didn't let them evolve and change, and that can be problematic also. So it's a real challenge for cities and how to plan that.
Yes, I know my area. I live in New Jersey, and that's changed quite a bit because we have a very large Asian Indian population. Do you have that in Boston as well?
Of course, yep. There's a lot of South Asians in Greater Boston. But certainly, as immigrant communities come to areas and do well financially, the incentive to congregate the way that the prior immigrant communities did is a little different, and there tends to be more of a diaspora of newer immigrant groups. Although, in places like East Boston and Chelsea and other neighborhoods like that, there's a lot of immigrants from Central America and South America. And create very rich and vibrant communities themselves. So, it's constantly evolving.
I have to tell you, it's kind of a funny story. The only thing I remember about Boston, I was in Boston once, a very long time ago, 1971. and I don't even remember the name of the store. I got lost. I got lost in the store. My father yelled at me, of course, but he put out a state alarm. That's way before cell phones and stuff. So he yelled at me for getting lost. But I don't even remember the name of the store. I really don't remember much of what I saw of Boston. It was a long time ago.
I wonder if it was Filing's Basement. That was. I think a lot of people got lost in Filing's Basement. Famous places to shop in Boston until the store closed, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago.
It could have been. My father was a salesman, and, he'd go to different places. I do have to ask you this because I couldn't find it in your book, but I was just wondering because I'm just curious. My dad served on the ship, the Bunker Hill in the Navy, World War II. Uh-huh. Is there any monuments in Boston about the ship, honoring that ship?
I don't know that ship specifically. During World War II, there was, of course, a very big Navy yard in Charlestown, as well as shipbuilding in Quincy. And the Charlestown Navy Yard was decommissioned in the 1970s, but remains the home of the USS Constitution, which is the oldest commissioned naval ship in the world and can be visited today. And it has the nickname Old Ironsides. Fought in the Battle of the War of 1812 against Great Britain. But there's quite a bit of history about the Charlestown Navy Yard preserved at a museum there, and there are other Navy vessels that are there. So if one were curious in that way, I would start with the museum at the old Charlestown Navy Yard.
I was just wondering. I don't know where it was that my parents were. I think they might have went to a reunion. And my father saw the plaque of his ship. I think it was in Massachusetts. And my mom couldn't figure out why he cried, which my father never really showed any emotion when he saw the plaque. And I said, well, what do you think? Do you think someone forgets about that? What they went through? Of course they don't forget what they went through.
Yeah, right.
And, it's just, it's just, the history of Boston, of course, you have about, and every city went through racial tension, in the 60s, 70s. Did Boston have riots?
Yes, there have been racial riots in the city. Controlled compared to some of the other cities. We did not get the destruction of racial riots the way that happened in Detroit and Watts and places like that. And I tell some of the stories about the efforts of the community to try to prevent widespread rioting in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But Boston certainly has been greatly troubled by race relations. And, of course, the history of school busing in Boston is one of the saddest chapters in the city's history and created enormous anger in the different communities and quite a bit of violence as well. And so that's a really sad part of Boston's race relations history was the school busing, federal order in the 1970s.
I remember that school busing changing in my town in New Jersey, and they were transferring kids from one part of town to the next to have more integration among the different ethnic groups, which I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and there was segregation, or it was just happened to be that way. The African Americans lived in one part of Carteret, and the whites lived in another. Now, of course, it's more mixed. There's all cultures now living in the hometown that I grew up in. What would you like to tell people? If I know it's difficult to narrow it down to one, but what you're proud of Boston.
I mean, it's a city of tremendous importance, as I think I mentioned, and so many firsts. One of the stories that I found most fascinating that I didn't know about, and I just think it's a really incredibly important story, is that Boston was the home of the first civil rights movement in America in the 1840s. More than 100 years before the civil rights movement in the American South in the 1950s and 1960s. And that, as I mentioned, slavery was allowed in all of the North American British colonies. And after the Revolutionary War in 1783, slavery was abolished in Massachusetts by several court decisions. It was never a legislative act, but it was a judicial act after the Massachusetts Constitution said that all men are created equal. And that was considered the basis to abolishing slavery in Massachusetts itself. The northern states all followed suit and abolished slavery, and of course the southern states did not. But the northern states were legally segregated in the first half of the 19th century before the Civil War. And the laws that we consider Jim Crow laws in the American South in the 20th century, the North had all those same laws in the first half of the 19th century. And I mentioned that the women's rights movement grew out of the abolition movement, but so did a homegrown civil rights movement in Boston. William Lloyd Garrison had founded the Liberator, which was an abolitionist newspaper in Boston in 1831, and he hired both women and African American lecturers to go around the country giving talks in support of the abolition movement. And a number of these African American lecturers were, started thinking to themselves, well, we're advocating for civil rights for people in the South. Well, what about at home? We don't have civil rights at home, and they started a movement in Boston in the 1840s to end legal segregation in the city, and they used all the same tools that the American civil rights movement used in the 1950s and 1960s: petitioning and boycotting and leafleting and civil disobedience. People would go into theaters and sit in the white section and be arrested to draw attention to this. 1843. The railroads in Massachusetts were legally desegregated. 1843, the law against interracial marriage was repealed by the Massachusetts legislative body, the General Court. 1847, Robert Morris became the first member of the bar in Massachusetts, only the second African-American member of a bar anywhere in the United States. And in 1851, by legislative act, the schools in Massachusetts were legally desegregated. Of course, we know that they essentially resegregated again in the 20th century, which is what led to the school busing. But really an incredible period of a civil rights movement that was led by the black community in Boston in the 1840s and really accomplished amazing things through this community-wide effort. And I think it's a really important story that has largely been lost to history.
That's interesting. Dan, I'm sure you know this because you're history buff, that all it takes is one person to stand up, to speak up. And I think it's a lesson that could be learned over and over again, because people think, I can't make a difference, and they can make a difference. And you read about this in history all the time of people making a difference by speaking up, by saying how they feel about something and then doing something about it. So I think that's important.
I think it's incredibly important, and I think throughout the book you see individuals making incredible contributions to innovation, to new ideas. But it's also the case that innovation and creative thinking and good decision making benefits from collaboration, from bringing different people from different types of backgrounds together to collaborate. And this notion of the inventor who sits isolated on a bench and a light bulb goes off and a new invention occurs is really one that's a myth, that through study of how innovation and inventions work, it's far more social and collaborative than used to be thought, and that most inventions are small incremental changes and improvements on things that had been created before. Even Thomas Edison, who we think of as the greatest inventor in American history and clearly incredibly important, and not to detract from him at all, but most of his work built on the work of other people. And he had labs, he had large groups of people that he was working with, and it's a great insight into how how inventions happen, how companies progress with research and development, but it applies to cities as well, is that we need to collaborate and work together and learn from each other. And through that, you get better decision making and better results.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I don't live far from Edison, New Jersey. That's like the next town over.
Yeah, I mean, such an
from where I live.
American, but by studying Edison, we get real insights into how those inventions happened, and it was far more social than we sometimes think.
Absolutely. I have to ask you this. You might think this question is kind of silly. I watch Cheers and the TV series occasionally. Is the bar really like that, as portrayed in the program?
The Cheers bar in Boston today. There is a Cheers bar, which the TV show is modeled after a bar called the Bull and Finch on the flat of Beacon Hill across from the Public Garden. But the TV set did not look like the old bar. What they borrowed from the old bar was more the vibe and the social nature of it, and the fact that everyone knew your name when you went in there. And the Bull and Finch became a very popular tourist location for many years, and finally they realized that the TV show's been off the air for a generation now, and they want to hearken to Cheers rather than call it the Bull and Finch that no one associates with the TV show. They suggest rebrand it as the Cheers bar, and so they try to make the bar a little bit more like the TV show. But the TV show itself was filmed on a set that did not look like the old bar that it was.
It didn't look like that. Yeah, I was wondering about that. And of course, there's the New England Patriots. Are they located? I'm not into sports, so I'm very sports naive. Are they located in Boston or somewhere else in Massachusetts?
So they're located outside of Boston, a little bit of a drive to the southwest in a town called Foxborough. And my book has about 50 pages of New England sports history, and I tell the history of course, the Celtics and Bruins and Red Sox and Patriots, but also college teams and lesser-known professional sports and women's teams as well. We have a women's professional football team, the Renegades, and we had a women's professional hockey team, Pride, but the women's professional hockey was reorganized this year, and Boston was awarded a franchise, so we're waiting to hear about that. And there was women's professional soccer with the Breakers, but they folded. They didn't survive, but Boston's getting a new women's professional soccer team coming up in a year or two. So I try to cover all that in the book, and I ask the question, because the book is really about cities, what is the relationship between successful sports teams and successful cities? Do cities themselves, if a city is successful, does it make the sports teams more successful, or sports teams are more successful, does it impact the quality of the city? And I try to ponder those questions while going through the history of sports teams. I certainly think having successful sports teams make cities more interesting places to be. It's a lot more fun to follow successful teams than teams that don't do well. And Boston's had plenty of sports success for the last 25 years, although a little bit less recently.
I'm sure that will probably be my son's favorite chapter, because my son loves to read about sports. And as a matter of fact, folks, I have to tell you, my son is reading the entire book through. And as a matter of fact, I said, Josh, let me take down the book when I did the interview, and he goes, "Don't lose my place. Make sure my marker stays where it is." And you mentioned music earlier, and I love all kinds of music. The Boston, the Newport Folk Festival, was that in around Boston or Massachusetts?
Oh, yeah, in Rhode Island. And the history of the book is really a history of New England with Boston as the capital city. So I talk about music from all around New England. and talk about the history of certainly of rock music, but also folk and jazz and blues history in the area, and country music that had a period of popularity here, and really interesting that Boston's music scene was most successful, at least the rock music scene, in the 1970s and 1980s, with groups like the Cars in Boston and Aerosmith and Jay Giles. So many great bands during that time. But it was also the period when the city was least successful. The city was losing, as I mentioned, losing population at the time. It was economically depressed. And there were also really great movies like The Verdict that were filmed in Boston, based in Boston in the 70s and 80s when Boston was really run down. The Friends of Eddie Coyle was an amazing movie from the 1970s, filmed in Boston. And so, I sort of asked the question because I try to explore the correlation, as I'm saying, with sports. What's the relationship between successful cities and successful culture, popular culture? And, sort of conclude that in some ways art can thrive during bad times. That sometimes, certainly with rock music, is the music of rebellion, and it can benefit when people are, to a certain extent, economically depressed because it's sort of rebellious music, and when times are really good, maybe there's less of a basis for writing really creative rock music. So, I sort of ponder those questions, although I don't have all the answers.
Yeah, well, I actually did see Jay Giles' band in the early 2000s, I think, down at the, what is it called, the PNC Art Center. They keep changing the name of it. I can't keep track of the name, in New Jersey. But I really, I love music, and I just, a country too, but, I grew up, the 60s and 70s to me had the best music because that's what I grew up with. And I really enjoy hearing the music. I like a variety of music, but more towards the old, country classic. And when I think of like the Newport, folk festival, I'm thinking of Bill Monroe and Bob Dylan and Joan Baez.
Oh, yeah, right. Absolutely.
Which, was very political back in that day, because they did talk about politics, and you knew what they stood for, and it was very very interesting back then. But I enjoy talking to you so much, Dain, and I want to thank you for writing this book and for coming on Chatting with Betsy. Where can people purchase your book?
Well, it's available, on online retailers like Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and bookshop.org carries it. And if you're in New England, it's available in most or many of the local independent bookstores, and I always love to support local bookstores. And if you're not from New England and your local bookstore doesn't carry it, I know that they can order it, and that they have it in the different book catalogs. It's available. But if you don't have a local bookstore to support, then certainly hope you'll consider buying it online.
And where can readers connect with you?
So I have a law firm website. Since I'm a lawyer, I don't have a separate author website, but my law firm's website is www. and then it's the name of my law firm, which is DainTorpy.com, DainTorpy.com, and our website tells about me as a lawyer and our law firm, as well as having a page about the book and upcoming live events in the New England area, most of which are in Massachusetts, but I'm going to be up in New Hampshire for one, at a bookstore, Balin Books, and other events in Massachusetts. Massachusetts Historical Society is having me. So lots of public events promoting the book, which I'm having a lot of fun with.
That sounds great. Well, I wish you lots of luck. And folks, I told Daniel before I started to record that when he retires, he could be a tour guide. I can definitely picture that as your second career.
My wife thinks that's going to happen, so you're not the only one who has that thought.
Yes. Well, I wish you lots of luck on your book. And folks, check it out. A History of Boston by Dain. That's spelled Dain. And I highly recommend the book. You can just pick it up, read what you want at that time, and just pick it up. Well, now that's what I'm doing. I, pick a chapter, read about it, and just, go through whatever I wanted to read at that particular, day. And I will be going back and to read what I didn't read already, because you have so much valuable, interesting history and information in this wonderful book. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for taking the time to do your research and the pictures in the book. And it's just, as I say, a home run. So congratulations to you for doing
you're so kind.
Wonderful job. You're welcome.
I've had great fun being on with you and talking to your listeners. It's been great. I really appreciate you having me on.
Oh, you are welcome. It is my pleasure. And folks, you were listening to Dain, and I think, again, I have phenomenal guests. And if you don't already subscribe to Chatting with Betsy, I really don't know what you're waiting for. I have phenomenal guests scheduled all the time. And Chatting with Betsy is free to subscribe to on Spotify, Spreaker, iHeart, YouTube, just to name a few, Amazon Music. And the information about Dain will be in the blog that Jeannie White, who's station manager, writes. And she produces the show. So thank you, Jeannie. And thank you to Lillian Caldwell, CEO of Passion World Talk Radio, who makes this all possible. And thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. And I really appreciate it if you would share the show, because I want to help people. And that's what I'm here for. I'm here to provide resources, information about history, cities, resources that could help you have a better life in many different areas. And you never know who I'm going to have on my show. And I have a great lineup coming up for the end of the year and next year. I already have guests scheduled through the end of March. So I just want to encourage everyone to subscribe. Tell your friends about Chatting with Betsy. And as I always say at the end of my show, in a world where you could be anything, please be kind and shine your light bright, because we need it now more than ever to show kindness, shine our light, and it would be a much brighter and happier world. That's what I believe. And if you want to follow me, I'm on Facebook, Betsy, B-E-T-S-Y, middle initial E, last name Wurzel, W-U-R-Z-E-L. And that's what I have to say today, folks. I forgot to say the disclaimer in the beginning, so I will say it now. The views of the guests may not represent those of the station or the host. And be safe, everyone. November's around the corner, literally. And I want to wish everyone happy holidays and just, love up on your fellow humans. We need it now. And again, that's what I have to say. Till we chat again, be safe. This is Betsy Wurzel, your host of Chatting with Betsy on Passionate World Talk Radio, a subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. Bye-bye now.